Hello, hello. Happy Sunday. Welcome to our live paint along for today. We are doing a fall landscape in acrylic. So you can see there on the left-hand side, the reference image that we'll be using is originally from Unsplash. So you can find a copy of this in the description. There's a link there so you can access the photo. Now, there are a couple different ways you can really approach starting this. I did start with just some very simple line work. This is some cold pressed watercolor paper, and then I just used some painter's tape to just tape around to give myself a little bit of a border. And you'll notice I didn't draw any leaves, and the reason for that is because we'll be painting them in. So to me, it just makes sense to have the structure of the branches. Now, another method of this, if you didn't want to start with a complete drawing, is you could actually paint the sky, paint the background, let things dry, and then bring the tree back in over top. That is another method. I just decided not to do it that way, just to start with the full sketch, just for teaching purposes and the amount of time we have. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started with that. So I didn't pick any colors ahead of time to start with necessarily. I kind of pick them as I go, but everything I'm using is Liquitex. I use a lot of the Liquitex Basics. I think that's really good for beginners and getting started. And then once you've, got some stuff down, you can try some Liquitex Professional. There's the heavy body line, soft body line, whatever works for you. So as far as colors go, I know I'm not going to start with some white, but I know I need some white. So I'm going to go ahead and get myself out some from my jar here. And I am just going to put it onto my palette paper. And I would just wipe off that knife when I'm done. And so where I'm going to start is with a wash. And I like to start with a wash because for a few reasons. One, it sets a tone. So I'm not just painting on white. I've got a middle value, allows me to kind of block in light and dark colors and be able to see them. But also what it provides is when there's little pops of open space or brushstroke, there's a color poking through. And because of how I painted this tree, I want to do a wash that I can just kind of cover everything. So I'm actually going to I've got this light blue permanent Liquitex Basics that I'm going to use. Now, if you don't have something like this, you could do like a primary blue, ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, and add just like a bit of white to it. But since I already have this ready to roll, I'm going to go ahead and use that. And I really like this particular image with the blues and the oranges. I think it's nice with the contrast, the complementary color scheme of the blue and orange. So that's why I'm just going to start with that wash. And then some of my sky, in fact, will start from that wash. Now, I could also do like an orange wash. So my sky, pops on that orange. It's, whatever you want to do here. And I do add a bit of water into my paint, and I just make a more transparent paint here with my acrylic. Now, you can safely mix some water into your paint without causing the binder to break down. Every paint is different, and I find the higher quality paint, the safer it typically is. But if you don't feel comfortable adding water and you don't want to add water to it, you can also add like a glazing liquid or medium, or other kinds of acrylic mediums to thin down your paint as well, if you prefer to keep it and not have to worry about the water and the binder. But I will tell you, I've never had any issues as far as that goes, but I know that is a concern for some folks. So just wanted to address that. And if you don't like the idea of starting with a wash, you can start just on white. That is okay. And you can also lay a ground down, meaning like before you even start with a sketch, you lay down a solid color of your choice. So there are different methods, different ways to approach it. But I'm a big fan of the wash. I also like the way it starts to set my painting down. It's like this ground I can start to build on. And I don't worry too much about brush stroke here. I just kind of take this flat brush and just kind of move it in all directions. And you just want it thin enough so you can see your sketch through there. And again, if you prefer to do the paint ground first and then sketch, that is another method. You know, they're different methods, different processes, different ways to do things. So I'm just a believer, you know, try different things, experiment, and you know, pick what works for you and what you like best. All right, so there's my wash. And again, what that kind of did for me is gave me a little bit of a background too. In fact, I could just keep this as my sky if I wanted to. I wouldn't really have to do much more. Now, we do see a little bit of kind of a fog. So I'm actually thinking, let's go ahead and start to put that fog in right now while we've got that background going. And as far as brushes, I usually try to keep some simple flat brushes and some round brushes is what I'll use for this painting here. So what I'm going to do is just kind of along where it's a little foggy, I'm going to bring a little bit of white paint, mix a little bit of that white with the blue there. And I'm just going to start to put a little bit in. Now, when I reference a photo, my goal is not to copy that photo exactly or to make it look like this is not a painting, but a photo. You know, I like to play with brushstroke. I like to play with the paint and the, you know, the different properties that it has. So don't feel too tied to that photo. It's not like you have to make it exact. It's more of a guide. It has some information we can use, some lights, some darks. And I'm also not too particular about color. I'm more concerned, do I like the color? And does the color fit with the value structure? And because I didn't paint these leaves, you know, there may be a little overlapping with the tree. I'm not going to worry about that. Paint can overlap a little bit because we'll use a darker color for that tree trunk and it'll cover right over top of this very beautifully. So yeah, I just want like a little bit of a hazy feel. Again, it does not need to be identical to that photo. But you know, this suggestion, we're kind of thinking about how we might want to apply the paint. So I try to move my brush around in kind of different directions to kind of minimize the look of a directional stroke. You can also kind of swirl your paintbrush around in a circular motion. That's called scumbling. And then, you know, if I want to, I can take just a little bit of that initial blue that I was using for the wash and just kind of on the edge, I can just kind of swirl a little bit of paint into there. With acrylic paint, there's basically two basic techniques that you're constantly thinking about, and that is wet on wet. So if I have two acrylic colors that are wet, I can blend them together. I can soften edges, I can merge colors, create new colors, all sorts of things. However, there's times when I need things to dry so I can actually build, I can layer. So that's important to keep in mind too. So I am going to just tap in a little bit more white on here. Again, it's coming down a little bit, but that will just get covered. And, you know, some of that hazy effect does pull down a little bit. So I'll kind of show you too how we can make that go down a little bit further. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just leave it there for now. And I want to get that little bit of the dark on the horizon there. And again, there is some kind of fog going over it. So the mixture I'm going to use to mix the black, actually, like you can use like a Mars black or an ivory black, but I don't want it to be super dark. So I like the combination of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. Now, if you don't have these exact ones, you could definitely do a different blue, a different brown if you want to, or a little bit of the any kind of blue, any kind of brown, really. And by the way, if you have questions, I've got the chat box up. I'll say sometimes it's hard to type and paint at the same time, but I can see you. Hey, Michelle. Hey, Leah. Feel free to type questions in the chat box if you have them, and I can answer them as I'm going to. So with that little bit of blue and brown there, you can see on my palette, I'm just going to pull kind of like half and half. And again, you'll get like a black you can mix. And no, it's not like a pure black like what you're seeing in a tube, like of the the Mars black or ivory black, but it is a nice, really dark neutral. It has a little bit more kind of a blue, but you could even mix a little black in there if you want. So what I'm going to do with a little bit of this color is just kind of lightly, and so I'm just not using heavy pressure, and I don't have a lot of paint on my brush. So sometimes it's about how much paint on you have on your brush and how much texture, or sorry, not texture, how much pressure you're applying. So I'm just kind of very lightly, because I want this to feel soft. I don't want it to feel really rigid. And this background isn't, it's going to push back eventually anyway. So it's not a primary focus. And then I'll just mix in a little white with that, and you'll get a bit of a gray. And then I'm going to bring that to this side. And I'm not worrying about the color I'm placing being super solid either. A little bit of that. That's why I like that wash in the background. That can poke through and help it, still feel fairly solid. So then with that area down there to the left, I'm just mixing in a little bit more white. And then I'm going to pull that down just a little bit. You see a shift in value. Again, I don't mind if mine's not exact, just this kind of suggestion of it. And I feel like with these when you're painting landscapes, you can be expressive with your brush stroke. You don't have to make things necessarily super smooth unless you want them to be. There's so many different approaches and ways you can apply. And don't be afraid to just experiment and see what happens, because acrylic paint, you can cover things up. And it's meant to be layered. It is not meant to be applied with one single swipe of a brush stroke. So don't be afraid to really build that up. This paint is designed to do just that. But you can kind of see, it's not exact to the photo, but just kind of putting in this kind of very soft, that bit of that horizon or trees in the background that we kind of see. But again, we want that to push back. That's not such an important piece of this. So the next thing I'm going to look at is the water here, and then I'm going to get a little bit of the reflection so I can continue this down. Then I think I want to see a little bit of the ground. We can work towards the tree trunk and the bench, and then we'll kind of finish with our leaves. That's kind of where we're headed. So as far as the water, if you look at the reference photo, it's definitely, there's some, it's darker than the sky, or it's a different blue. So what I'm going to do is add a little bit of primary blue to my palette that I can mix with this light blue permanent. Now, if you don't have primary blue, ultramarine blue is great, cobalt's great, phthalo blue is great. You can just pick any kind of blue you have and mix with some white. So what I'm going to do here for the water. Now, when you look at the water, we do see some different reflections. It is darker here. Progressively, as it goes back, it'll get a little bit lighter. We do see a little bit from it being shallow, like a little bit of maybe the sand or the bottom of the water, in fact. So it's just how much of that do you want to include? Totally up to you. It's going to look like water even if you don't put every little detail in there. So I try to think about the big picture first. I worry about kind of bigger areas to smaller areas. So when I look at this water, I notice that the largest area is a little bit darker. So I'm going to just, with my brush, just kind of loosely draw a little bit of a line. And I am just grabbing a little bit of white, primary blue, and this, again, this light blue permanent that I have, and just kind of making a little combination. Now, this water is not one flat color, so don't feel like you've, got to mix a big old batch of a color and, lay it in all over. What I kind of do is gradually grab some different colors of blue and just kind of let that, kind of start to layer it and place the blue next to each other. If you want to darken the blue, so blue, if it's bright like this is much brighter than what's actually in the picture. So one thing you can do to kind of lower that intensity actually is a little bit of orange. And if you don't have an orange in a tube, just use a little yellow and a little red. and you can make an orange. And I'm talking a little smidgen. You don't need much. Also, a little bit of brown can work, kind of like we made the black. You can just put a little bit of brown in. So then what I'll do with this orange is just mix a little bit in there. And you want to mix it really thoroughly, not just in like one little spot, like mix your whole little pile up. And then you probably noticed that got a little bit darker. So yeah, I'll lay that there. So you can see that was my initial color. And then this was when I added the orange. So notice the orange kind of muted that color down a little bit, lowered the intensity. So it's more of the color I'm seeing in the photo. And again, even though I don't care that I'm exact to the photo, I still like to kind of match the value structure and the general, whether a color is really bright or not. I tend to like to match that a little bit too. So, but it all depends. So with this flat brush, I'm just kind of making some horizontal lines. To me, water reads as very horizontal strokes. So I just kind of mimic that a little bit, not exclusively. Sometimes I'll use my brush in a different direction, and then what I'll do is kind of take it and then pull it out the other way. So sometimes when you're blocking in or going around things like we are in this case, it's helpful to turn your paper if you're not, or your canvas, if you're not attached to like a easel, or some folks like to paint like tape to a board or something like that. So just kind of depends, but what I find helpful is turning and making it easier to get in to an area versus trying to reach my hand over and doing it that way. So I'm just darkening a little bit of that blue. Oops, I actually went over my grass just a little bit, but right here is actually going to be some grass, but this is no problem at all. Sorry, you can't see that. Right here, I'm just going to let that dry and I'll paint green right over top of it. No problem at all. And then I can actually use this little bit of a darker color I made. I'm going to put a little bit of brown in it and a little bit more blue. And I can kind of use this almost for like that little shadow, cast shadow into the water. And again, as I mentioned, that concept of wet on wet or wet on dry. So do you want things to sort of blend together, be really soft, or do you want to let them build up and you are letting things dry and then painting over top? This I'm actually going to end up putting a little bit more brown in, I think, but this works for now. So just kind of lightly putting in this reflection. And what's going to happen as we start to paint like the tree and the bench and the grass, everything back here is going to push back and the new stuff that we'll paint in will come forward. So keep that in mind. Sometimes when you're painting the background, it just kind of feels more intense, but like I said, we'll get there. And then what I'm going to also do with that background a little bit, as you push back, it's a little bit lighter through here. So again, while that paint's wet, I just added a little bit more white onto my brush. And I'm just going to put in, and this is not the exact color, but that's okay. Like I said, I'm not personally overly concerned with that. All right, I'm going to grab just a little bit of a smaller brush real quick. Just rinsing my brush off here. And then what I want to do is just lighten just a bit of what I was doing there. Get a little bit of a lighter blue. And then just kind of fill this in a little bit. In fact, I think this could even be a little bit more white on here if I wanted. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll grab a color and actually work it onto the canvas or the surface. Again, while the color is wet, you can do some of that. And then, as I pull this way, I'm going to have to bring some more color in so I can soften those edges. So if you want soft transitions, soft edges, again, you just want the colors to be wet. And acrylic dries fast. It dries very fast. So if you don't get the blend you were looking for right away, that's okay. Let it dry and then go again on top. You can also use, there are different, so this is Golden, the brand is Golden, but this is an additive called retarder for mixing into acrylic paint, and it just makes the paint stay wet longer. So that's an example of something you could do too if you are noticing that you struggle with that and it dries really fast and you just can't get those blends you want. And I'm just kind of filling in this negative space. Again, I'm playing with the paint and I'm thinking about, what do I want it to look like? What kind of texture do I want? Do I want to kind of tap my brush and have it feel soft? Do I want to see directional brush strokes? Those are all things you can kind of decide as you're painting. And again, things that you don't have to stay, or be rigid with the photo. And if there's ever a time where you just want to stop looking at the reference image, you can do that too and just focus on your painting itself. So I'm going to go ahead and just fill in a little bit more here. And I am going to bring a little bit more of that fog in. I always call the first layer of paint blocking in. It's not really focusing on detail at that point. It's just kind of getting the basic loose color value structure in place, and then you can continue to build up and layer as you go. So then what I'll kind of do from here is just kind of work the water until I like it. So I'm just going to kind of gradually start mixing some different kind of blues. And I have a little bit more space to fill over here. And the other thing you're going to want to fill actually is in between your bench too. Which the bench is another example of yeah, you can paint it after the fact. I just tend to like to work out my composition in its entirety before I start painting, usually. That works well for me. And, when you're painting from references like on splash.com or photos you've taken, you can also have several reference photos that you merge together. That can be a really fun thing to do too. Okay, so now that I've got, at least there's paint everywhere, what I'm going to do now is just kind of go through and just kind of touch some stuff up a little bit. And I could come back to the water, but I kind of want to be done with it. I kind of just want to get it to where I want it to be. And because it sets back, I want to be done with all the stuff in the back so I can focus on, more of the detailing and the stuff in the foreground and the focal points and all of that. So again, I just kind of go around and I'll just make sure things are blended the way I want. I'll make sure the value is distributed the way I want. I like to see, a balance of the color. If I've got a little bit of this color over here, I like to see it over here a little bit too. And, it is lighter too up here, a little bit lighter than what I've actually got. So I'm just going to go ahead and just with some nice kind of horizontal strokes, just kind of filling that in. And I want to see a little on this side of the trunk as well. And, I just kind of want to make sure my brush strokes feel consistent, and again, things just are kind of where I want them to be. You can water your paint down just a little bit with these top layers if you want to. That's called glazing. What that does is allows the little bit of color underneath to kind of pop through. So the other thing I kind of want to do is just soften this edge a little. So I'm going to just scumble. I'm just taking my brush with the little bit of paint that was on there, and I'm just going to kind of swirl it over the edge. just to kind of create a little bit of a softness. This isn't something you have to do. You could leave it as is, but I like that little bit of the foggy feeling, that idea that it's kind of being pushed back a little bit. And just a little bit more white kind of through here. Same idea. Just kind of lightly scumbling and swirling my brush around. And I know I said I want to be done with the water, but honestly, if I decide later that there's something else I want to add to it, I definitely can. And then I'm going to use a little bit of the white to just kind of edge and shape the reflection just a bit there. And, I think I'm going to go ahead and call that good. And I might come back to it and work a little bit more on it, but actually, take that back real quick. I do need to get a little bit of color inside this bench, this little strip here. It's probably not the best brush to do that, but I can go ahead and fill some things in there. So while that's kind of drying up, what I'm going to do now is just get a little bit of some grass on there. And, as far as greens go, you can make a green. You could do your own green with a yellow and a blue. If you've got different greens, like I've got a phthalo green and a light green permanent I can use. To lighten your green, yellow tends to work really well. I mean, you can do white, but white tends to make green look more pastel. So I like to use white a lot, especially like back here where you see a little bit of that highlight. So like a cad yellow, a lemon yellow, primary yellow, whatever kind of yellow you might have can work. And what I'm going to do then is I'm kind of ignoring those there are some leaves that are on the ground. I'm going to ignore those just for a minute and kind of just try to focus on the grass itself and not even some of the blades right away or like detail of the grass, but just a little bit more of the just kind of base of the grass. And I'm just putting in a little burnt umber into some phthalo green, and I actually have this light green permanent that's getting in there too. And just kind of squinting at the image, I just kind of look at where it's a little bit darker first. I'm just kind of taking this flat brush, just very kind of loose application of color. I'm applying some of this dark green here in some different areas. And then I'm going to put some lighter green. And then we'll get that cast shadow in there too. That cast shadow is really nice from the tree. But I just like to get a little dark. Typically, I like to work dark to light, but it's not always the case. It does kind of depend. Maybe a little bit up here. And then, from here, I'll just kind of start to fill in some of the negative space, allow some little overlapping to happen. I am going to take a little brush and I will put some little blades of grass in there too. But right now, I'm just looking for kind of this very flat, basic application. And as always, I feel like there's so much room for making these your own and doing things your way. There are so many approaches to making art, brushstroke styles, different ways you can make it look. So I think it's fun to just experiment. And again, I think acrylic is a safe medium to do that with because you can paint over something if you don't like it. So again, green's not exactly how, oops, that was the shadow actually going around that. But this is, I think, just a nice base. And then what I can do is start to block in some more strokes and kind of put some of those fallen leaves on the ground too. But I just kind of wanted those to sit more on top. And that cast shadow is pretty darn dark, really, if you look at it. I personally, in this painting, am not going to do any actual black. I'm only going to do my mix black that I've made from burnt umber and ultramarine. So that's what I'm going to make my shadow. Now, if you want to put a smidge of green in there, you could. Another thing you could do is use the complement to make a shadow. So in the case of green, that would be a red. So like a cad red, a primary red. If I mix a little bit of red into my green, it's really going to darken it. If I go 50-50, it neutralizes completely and makes like a brown tone. So that's another option. There are different ways that you can do it. But I'm just going to take a little burnt umber and a little ultramarine blue there. And I can use the same color I'm mixing for parts of the bench, like the little parts coming back with the legs and the parts underneath the little beams, support joints, and then actually parts of the tree as well. So that's kind of where I'll head next, is kind of the shadow, bench, tree, and then starting to block in some leaves. And because the leaves are so dense and there's so many, we'll really want to do that in layering and kind of building it up. So in between layering up here, we'll also pop down to the grass and start to kind of make it look like little blades in there and also maybe some fallen leaves. And again, I always just have to go back and say my goal is to never make this a total copy of the photo. That photo is my jumping off point. Yes, the composition is the same, but the application and how colors look and texture and how that transforms can totally be my own. So I don't have to worry about that too much. So what I'm going to do, I think, is switch over to a round brush. This is a number 6 round. I think it's just a little bit easier for getting into these sorts of shapes. So that's something to think about too, is like, what brush are you using? Is it working well? I usually try to use the biggest brush I possibly can for a certain area that I'm painting, but again, it always varies. But one thing to know is if it's not going well, if something's not working right, one of the first things I do like to check is what brush I'm using. And I am putting just a dot of my phthalo green in there to just to get a little bit of a green in there, since it's actually, the cast shadow is on the grass. So it would make sense that you would see there would be some green in there too. And, I might need to layer this again too. As I mentioned, acrylic paint is really meant to be layered. So never necessarily expect that you're going to apply something in one single layer and you're done with that area. I definitely revisit areas. I kind of call myself more of like a chaotic painter. I hop around and like to work an entire painting. It's definitely not like a beautiful step by step, do this first, this second. There really is multiple ways you can approach how to paint, an order of painting. Because I just think our brains are all different. So I might kind of gravitate towards one area in a particular moment, and you might feel like you want to work on a different area, and that's fine. And again, at Kesha, I just want a little bit kind of a softer edge. So I just kind of think about light pressure as I'm applying the paint. Again, this is just a ultramarine blue and some burnt umber with a little dot of phthalo green in there, just because this is a cast shadow on the grass. And a lot of my strokes, I'll kind of, in the beginning, allow them to run together a little bit more, like I'm filling in areas. And then a lot of my smaller brush strokes will tend to be more on top of this. That's just kind of how I paint. But even in these early stages, if you want to leave like little areas poking through so you can see some of the wash, you can definitely play with brush stroke too. It doesn't have to be smooth like I'm painting right now. I'm just kind of bringing that cast shadow over to the tree there. Cool. So the next thing I'm going to do is block in the tree, but I will revisit the grass. Now that I got this cast shadow in, it really, shadows and light work together, right? Shadows make the light shine brighter. So this shadow here is really allowing me to see how bright the light is shining right in this strip. You can see that on the reference photo. So I know I'm going to come visit that area to push that light in. So while I've got this dark color here, I'm just going to size down my brush just a little bit to a 3. And then what I'm going to do is with that same dark color that I was using, that burnt umber and ultramarine, I am going to go ahead and just fill in the part on the bench here. And we see the beams kind of going this way, kind of diagonal line in there. And as I'm painting, like if I observe things in the background or in the water that I want to touch up or do something with, I absolutely can. Like I said, I kind of wanted to be done with it so I could just move on, but I can revisit an area definitely. And then I see a little bit of kind of the bench leg, so I'm going to fill that in. And as I'm filling in the legs, I'm kind of like, oh, I see, some more green area that needs to kind of come in here too. So really quickly, I'm just going to wash my brush, grab a little bit of green, and just fill in a little of this space that didn't get any color just yet. And I'll be coming, like I said, I'll be coming back to some of these areas, but I just kind of like to make sure they've got a layer of paint on there before moving on. And I'm going to also, I don't know how bright I can get this right now, but maybe we'll bring just a little brightness in there and then we'll revisit. Again, letting that layer build up. I want to get a little bit more kind of yellowy, some white and yellow in there, but that's good for now. Okay, so let's go ahead and go back to the tree. Now the tree, I'll probably be using both the 6 and the 3 and kind of going back and forth a little bit. With the bigger area of the trunk, I can use a little bit bigger brush. And then as I get to some of these branches, I'm going to do a little bit of a smaller brush for that. So again, with the tree, like if you look at the tree and kind of squint at it, you notice on the left-hand side of the trunk is really dark. And then because of that light coming in this direction, we see a little bit of light coming up it too. So I do want to pay attention to that. I like the bit of light on there. Seeing where our light's coming from is really nice. But I am going to start with the dark section. So again, some burnt umber with some ultramarine, because if you look at the dark section of the tree with the cast shadow, look where they meet up. It's like almost like pretty much the same value. You could even say that is an implied line, meaning like there's a line there. There's a line from the tree trunk to the ground, but you might not see it because of the cast shadow, but our mind sort of fills it in. So that's why it's called implied line. But if you want to shift that so you can actually see it, go for it. As I'll constantly mention this, I'm a broken record, but there are so many ways to paint and so many choices that you can make. And I know when we're beginners, that can feel very overwhelming. So it's okay to not even think too much about it and just kind of let it happen. I always tell students, as long as you keep painting or keep drawing or keep practicing whatever it is, you're going to get better. And a personal style will just kind of naturally start to emerge. Um, Almost like I always say this too, a little broken record, but as unique as our handwriting is, so is the way we apply paint. So I think that's, I don't know, it's really fun and exciting. So have fun with it. Don't feel like you have to compare it to mine or make it look like mine. There's so many different ways. So I am going to kind of fill this tree in much like I have the other areas where it's more not necessarily solid, but kind of more blended. And then I'll be adding a little bit more line work on top for like a little bit of the texture of the bark. So I'm just kind of thinking of some lines over here on the right as I'm kind of seeing just a bit of dark there. And then I have that little space where I can fill in the highlight. And then as I start to work my way up, I've got all these branches, and I definitely did not include every single branch, but a lot of them. And you could easily freestyle some more in and just kind of paint some more in, or, you know, whatever you want to do as far as that goes. But what I'm going to do with these branches is just start to block in this color I'm using. Because many of these branches they're a little bit kind of read as like a silhouette where they're kind of backlit with how the sun is coming from the side there. It just kind of reads it as really dark. So I'm just going to kind of maintain that for most of it. Again, I don't mind if the color shifts slightly. It does not need to be the exact same mix, meaning maybe you have a little bit more blue one time or a little bit more brown the next time, or maybe you have some other browns like a burnt sienna or a raw umber or a Van Dyke brown that you want to add into this too. So think about tree trunks and bark on a tree trunk. It is not flat. It's not one color. We see multiple lights and darks in there. So don't be afraid to, you know, have some different browns in here. It's going to look more natural that way. And then as branches start to get a little thinner, as I mentioned, you might find it easier to kind of use a thinner brush as well. The thing with branches too, if you make a little mistake, you could add a little divot or another little kind of branch or shape off of it. It's, you know, you got options as far as that goes. And as far as that little highlight, I think what I'm going to try with my burnt umber is I'm going to add in just a bit of yellow oxide. Is kind of, when I quick glance at that tree, it kind of almost looks a little yellowish to me from how the sun is shining on there. But you could definitely try something different if you prefer. I'm going to try just a little yellow oxide mixed in. And I'm going to try that on there. And already I'm thinking, you know, maybe I'll make it a little bit brighter, but let's go ahead and just use this for my block in. And then if I want to go back and make things lighter, I can. But, you know, there's areas too where we see a little bit the light and dark, they kind of interact together a little bit. It's not a clearly defined line. And then as we head up this way on the tree too, it darkens just a bit. All right, so now what I'm going to do is just switch to a little bit of a smaller brush as I start to block some of this stuff in. And then, you know, all these little branches I have going over here, I'm going to start to fill in. And so this is kind of what I was talking about at the very beginning. you could have just laid on the ground and then added the tree on top, versus the kind of going around that we're doing right now. Again, just different ways to do things. And it's about what feels better to you, I think, and what works with how you like to paint. As I mentioned, I kind of like to see my line work in there ahead of time. So I typically like to draw most everything before I begin painting. But like the leaves, that's an example of something that just makes sense to paint in regardless. But you still could definitely draw some basic leaf shape in if you wanted, or if you want to simplify the leaves a little bit. I'm just going to be using a brush for the leaves when we get there, but honestly, like sponges can work. You can like cut up little pieces of sponges, some different things you can do. And with these branches, by the way, if you are finding that your paint isn't super smooth, try just a little teensy bit of water on your paintbrush, and it just helps the fluidity of the paint a little bit, depending on what kind of paint you're using. Now, if you're using like a craft paint, that you get from like Michael's Joann Fabrics, in the little tubes, that tends to be a lot thinner of acrylic paint, so it tends to flow right away without, any water or any glazing medium or anything like that. But you can also thicken that paint up, by the way. There's different mediums that you can get that thicken paint as well as thin it. So just a little FYI if you find yourself with that kind of paint. And again, I'm just kind of looking, what is lighter, what's darker. Darker values tend to push back in space, and lighter values tend to come toward us. So, I want a range in here, basically. And as I mentioned, you can paint in more branches as you're going to. I'm actually going to, this might feel weird on the video for a minute, but I am actually going to flip this upside down just so I'm not reaching so much. And I'm going to go ahead and start filling in some of these branches. And some of them feel, like little random lines because of how the leaves are dispersed. You see bits of the branch with, leaves going around. So that's why I drew them split like this. But, as I'm painting, I might find I want to add more branches or more leaves, or, that stuff can shift as you're going too. But this just gives me a nice little kind of starting off point. You even see some little kind of random little ones through here. So I know sometimes when we're painting, the in process phase can feel strange, but remember, it's in process. Paintings don't have to, it's a lot of pressure, I always say, to have it look like amazing the entire time, as you're creating it. So just remember, you're building something, it's growing, it's developing. I think it can be fun to take photos in different stages of my paintings. I think it's very eye-opening. It teaches you a lot about the process of building things up and creating layers. And some of these branches, I could make them thicker, I could make them thinner. Lots of options here. If I even wanted to size down a brush, I could, because when you look at the tree, when you really look at it and observe it, you will notice we've got branches of different thicknesses. And of course, as branches extend out from the tree, each one starts to get a little thinner too. Getting close here. And, I always say with paintings, for me, it is a rare thing, unless it's a little study, that I sit down and finish a painting in an hour or even an hour and a half. Paintings to me are something that you develop over time. I like to take breaks from my work and come back with fresh eyes because I believe that you can, you just need breaks from things when you've been looking at them for a really long time. I think it's helpful to step back, take a little break, come back, feel refreshed. So, keep that in mind as we're going. You might not finish right away. And not to mention, everybody's different and we all work at different paces too. So, and sometimes I've actually painted this scene once before in a little study, but I never quite finished it. So I kind of had an idea of how I wanted to work out the composition. But, sometimes if I decide I want to or if I take a reference photo of a painting or something, or sorry, let me start that over. If I take a reference photo of a subject matter that I want to use for a painting, um, there's different ways you can kind of work with that too. So you can definitely combine imagery. You don't need to use references if you don't want to, but I often think, our brains turn things into symbols like trees, for example. We don't necessarily, if we think about a tree, we can picture it, but we miss out on some of the details. So I think sometimes having references for that reason is really good. But yeah, references in our live classes will always either be from unsplash.com or a reference photo that I have taken. But landscapes can be really fun to make up on your own as well. But there's details that we see here, like I mentioned, like the branches, direction of branches, the bark, how the fog kind of looks. All of that I think is helpful information. So the last thing I'm going to do here, that I filled in all of the branches that I have, but I'm going to just put in a few little rogue ones. I'm making them up. But when you look at the image, you'll notice this is what they really look like. They're very thin and they just kind of cross over. Branches kind of can start to feel like they're merging a bit. So just very, very light. Some branches too at the end, they curve a little bit. They're not all perfect straight. We've got all this variety here. So I'm just lightly adding in a little bit of line work there. Again, this is random, just kind of freestyling it. I'm looking just a little bit there at the reference image just for kind of direction of things, but other than that. So there are definitely some more I could add to the trunk and the branches there. But what I'm going to do for now is just let this dry and add into the bench, because then everything on my page will at least have some color on it, and then I can start adding in some of these leaves. So I do want to differentiate the bench a little from the tree. I don't want it to feel like that same brown. So I'm actually going to add a burnt sienna to the mix. I have not used this color yet. It's a really nice neutral. If you don't have a burnt sienna, you could do another brown, like a burnt umber or a Van Dyke brown, and add like a smidge of red to it, like an alizarin crimson or primary red or cad red, whatever kind of red you have. But this is, yeah, it's a little bit more of a reddish brown. It's a little warmer brown than burnt umber. And so what I'm going to do here, I will kind of grab a little burnt umber with it. And then I'm going to mix in the burnt sienna. And just using that same number 3 round brush, I'm just going to block this in. So yes, there is some variation, but I'm not going to worry too much about that right now. And this yellow ochre actually I have is going to be a little nice kind of lighter value or lighter color to make a lighter value on the bench. So there is a little, yellow oxide. Now, I did get a little excited with that last brush stroke and did paint in a little negative space here. So this is a great example of acrylic paint. I'm just gonna let that bad boy dry, and then I can repaint a little bit of blue in there. So no big deal. And then as I get to the edge here, I notice a bit of that highlight is hitting that bench just a bit there. So I am going to lighten that. I just add a bit of white to lighten that side of the bench just a bit there. And then, there's just different browns as we're working on this bench that you're going to notice. So I just try to, the best of my ability, put in different lights and darks where I see them. So I'll just ask myself, if an area that I'm painting, I'll say, is this value I have work? Is it too light? Is it dark enough? I'll kind of ask myself questions like that rather than like, well, how do I paint a bench? I'm just trying to look for values, shapes, lines, and just try to break things down as best as you can. And trust me, that's a skill to develop. You might not find you're great at it right away. And in fact, it's something I'm still developing. I feel like as you continue to practice as an artist, you just learn new things constantly. There's constant little discoveries as you're painting. And I just feel like then as you paint new things, you'll be like, oh yeah, I did that in this landscape. I can try that again here. Just different little techniques that you might pick up or find useful. And, just getting comfortable with your brushes, comfortable with mixing, comfortable with the application of the paint. Again, those basic concepts of wet on wet, so things blend together versus letting things dry and then building up layers. And again, don't be afraid to layer up that paint. It does not have to be applied in a single coat. And again, that basic block in, I'm just kind of more concerned about getting paint on my surface. Then I can start to kind of add texture, extra detailing, to make it feel finished. Again, this little area on the ends just a bit lighter. If you put some paint down where you didn't mean to and the back is dry, you can actually use a little bit of water on your paintbrush. I did this right here, and actually blot it back up. And acrylic paint will lift actually, but you do have to get in there relatively quickly. All right, I'm actually going to really quick before that blue dries too much on me. Grab just a little bit of the blue, and I just want to touch up in between this bench a little bit. Kind of filling that in. And again, I want to wait to do this when the brown paint has dried, right? So I can actually paint on top. I'm going to grab some new paper towels really quick. Paper towels come in handy with all the blotting. All right, let's get this bench finished and then we will get on to some of these leaves and get going. And as I mentioned, you are probably going to find you need more time. Take as much time as you need. I feel like in our little live sessions we've been doing, get you, you know, a good chunk of the way on your way there. And then, as I mentioned, it's really nice to just take a little break, come back, finish things up, and go from there. And if you would like to email me photos of your art, I would love to see. My email is actually just my first name and last name at gmail.com. So jenniferfunnel at gmail.com. And it is in my about. If you go to my about, you can find my email there. But feel free to email me if you'd like to share your art. I think it's really fun to see, people's take on things. So I'm just gonna pop in a little bit of the lighter area on the bench here. And I know some of those little boards on the bench might feel a little confusing because there's actually like one here and then the kind of the seated part, I should say. So it does get a little tricky. So I'm just taking a bit of a light. Remember, values can help you to differentiate different areas. But I still feel like even with kind of a loose coat of paint on that bench there, you get the gist of it, of what it is. I feel like there's no second guessing it's a bench, at least. So I'm just putting in this little dark edge through here. And then I actually noticed there is one other little spot of green kind of in this negative space with the bench here that I want to fill in. Okay, so now things are blocked in. So now that things are blocked in, what we want to do from here is start to add leaves, start to add detailing, texture, fine tune anything we might want to fine tune. So, for example, as I'm kind of looking at this, I'm noticing, oh, you know what? My fog back there could be a little bit brighter, could lighten that. So, I'm grabbing some white paint and just swirling a round brush in it. And in fact, I'm going to take some and even blot some off. And then what I'm going to do with that is just kind of lightly swirl that around. And I'm just bringing in a little bit more shadow, or sorry, a little bit more fog over top of that cast shadow. And then if I want to, another thing I could do, I need a little bit more of my ultramarine burnt umber mix for my DIY black. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix these two together. And I'm just going to bring in a little bit more of that shadow back there. Not the shadow, I should say, but that kind of tree line. Just want to kind of push it back a little bit. So I just kind of fine tune some of this stuff a little bit here. And you can just kind of mess with that as much as you want and get it to a point that you like. Again, I just kind of want it to feel soft and push back. I don't need it to have too much detailing. Mix a little gray up here. And then just bring a little bit into here. And then just a little bit more fog. This is the white again. I'm going to just pull in just a little bit more through here. And this is just scumbling, just kind of swirling it around, not having a ton of color on there or paint on there. And then again, I just want a little bit more kind of through here. I'll bulk that up just a little bit and see look at that soft edge on there. And I could honestly keep fussing with that background if I wanted to, but I'm just gonna go ahead and stop. So the leaves, I'm gonna just switch my palette paper around. I am going to use, I've got a cad orange, which is like a really bright orange. So I do want, I'm going to do some cad yellow deep. And you could sub these out for other colors that you have that that might work. And then I'm going to do a little alizarin crimson. And honestly, we do see bits of green in parts of the leaves too, but that's really up to you if you want to add that. So with these leaves, now there are some more prominent leaves like here that you see more of their shape. So leaves that appear bigger and you see more shape are closer, right? And then the other leaves, you know, are smaller. They kind of push back in space a little bit. So I like to use different brushes. I like to kind of hop around and we're really going to build these leaves up. So my thought process is we'll kind of paint for probably like another 20 minutes or so. I usually like to keep these around like an hour and 20 minutes for our lives because I know anything longer than that, it's hard to stay and listen to someone for that length of time. But what I'm going to do is just kind of mix some different little piles up here of some of these colors for the leaves. And in fact, I think I'm going to add just a little bit of white to get a little bit brighter color or lighter. White, I should mention, does not brighten, it only lightens. So sometimes that's why we need yellows and other colors to mix together. And like I said too, there's even little spots where we see some that are kind of green. Now, orange and blue are complementary, or yellow and violet are complementary. So if you need to dull down some of these colors a little bit, if you want to kind of create some duller colors to kind of push back in space, try mixing complements. Complements are lovely. And I'm just using my same little round brush, and I personally like to kind of squint at the trees. And when you squint, you kind of just start to notice little shapes of the color. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of hop around and I'm almost like just doing little taps. Now, if you want to spend some more time and have some of those leaves be a little bit more shapely, you can. You know, it's how much time do you want to spend? You know, that's what it comes down to. The more realistic a painting is, the more time was spent rendering the information, you know, from the original location, if it was an on-site painting or if it's a portrait, the reference of that actual person. So it's, how much do you want to add? Me personally, I like to simplify. I like to create expressive versions of things. To me, that's kind of that fun problem solving piece. So I'm definitely simplifying. I like to squint a lot when I look at the tree from the reference because squinting just kind of helps blur out some of the fine details and allows you to see some of the bigger picture, which I think can make things a little bit easier. And I hop around so things can dry. So I'm not creating like a big pile or a big mess. Because if I'm layering wet paint on wet paint on wet paint, that's what will happen. But I want to see a little bit of differentiation in color. I want to see overlap. I want to see layering. I want to feel the denseness of this tree, right? So that's what I need to do to make that happen. I need to hop around. And, I look in these negative spaces. I also see areas where the leaves come over top of the branches. So there's so much variety here. And try different brushes. You can even, if you've got like a little extra scrap paper or something, even honestly, some printer paper or the back of a junk mail envelope, try out some different brushes and try different leaf shapes if you don't like just the little taps. There are different ways to do it. Like I said, I just want mine to feel kind of soft, and this is going to take a little bit to build up. This can be time consuming. Oops. And then you do that, make a little mistake, and we'll just kind of tap around it. No big deal. And then this is, that part too, where I could totally come in and add more branches after I get some of the leaves in there too, to really play up that layering. And then I'll just kind of grab different colors periodically. You can let the paint be a little thicker, a little thinner, so many different ways you can do it. But yeah, it's just kind of a repetition process now. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Layer, layer, layer. Gradually, occasionally maybe make a little bit of a darker value. Again, we need those dark values to go back in space and light values come forward. We get a sense of dimension and space when we have both in a painting. They work together, but you can't do it all at once, right? So that's why we need to build up these layers little by little. It's growing, it's developing. This can be great. Take little pictures if you want to as you're progressing to just show the process being built up. It can be very eye-opening. Now, some people might like to take bigger brushes and kind of put some bigger strokes in and then put smaller ones on top. That can be a great way to layer. And red and green are complements, so sometimes I'll do a little red and green in there. Get me some of that duller kind of orangey color that I'm seeing. And at this point in time too, you can even, oh, here was a little happy accident. I just kind of touched that to the ground. You can even kind of start to put some little taps on the ground too. Because this ground, the grass, is really just kind of built up layers of texture. So I can come back with a small brush and maybe put some little line work in there to build up the grass. I think landscapes are really fun. I think there's a lot of room for trying different things and it's still, looking like a landscape. There's so many styles from very realistic to more expressive and even like fauve landscapes where, the colors aren't realistic necessarily. They're a play on colors. Acrylic paint can be applied very thickly if you want it to be. So you can let the texture stay if you want it to be a little bumpier. Sometimes stuff that's flatter pushes back and stuff that's bumpy comes forward. So, that's one way to look at it. And I always typically paint a little slower when I'm talking too. So that's part of it. Is you're kind of, engaging your right brain and your left brain at the same time, which can be a challenging thing to do. By the way, oranges and yellows tend to be a little bit more on the transparent side. So if you want to increase the opacity for, like, example, the leaves that are kind of going over top of the trunks and whatnot and the branches, adding just a little touch of white into that can really make a world of difference. But I love the leaves kind of overlapping this background we've created to really provide that sense of depth and, again, how these trees with lots of foliage would appear. But you can see I've got a ways to go to keep building that up. So it is a time consuming thing. And you decide when you're done. That's really up to you. And maybe, I don't know, I'm just gonna change to a different brush just for a little bit of a different shape. And just kind of squinting, looking, where's it really full? Where do I need to kind of fill things in? I do like the idea that there's maybe still a few little bits of green kind of hanging on. But usually, if I'm going to put some green in that tree, I better put it in a few little places so it looks intentional. But sometimes we see that we still see little bits of green, or almost like a yellow green too. Things are starting to shift, but some of those leaves hang on for a little bit. So yeah, if you like that idea to pop a few little greens in there, go for it. Like I said, I just recommend if you do that, you put it in a few spots for balance. And as I start to layer more, I'm gonna get some more orange, more yellow, continue to build that up. Just like I said, to occasionally let things dry. You can come back to them. And then I am going to work on the leaves just for a couple more minutes here. And then I want to talk about a couple other things, areas to kind of look at that you could finish up or add to. And then, yeah, we'll wrap it up from there. But as always, any questions you have, even if you're watching the recording of this, by the way, feel free to pop in questions in the chat and I can answer those or leave a comment. And if you're watching too and have ideas of what you'd like me to paint next, let me know. I'm just adding in a little, this is like a yellow with a lemon yellow with a touch of that, what green did I use? Light green permanent. And I'm just popping in a little bit, I kind of want to see through just a little bit, but I'm just popping in a few little kind of areas of grass and the highlight just to kind of build up that texture a little bit. This is actually my favorite part of a painting. Blocking in is all nice. It's great. You get a lot done when you're doing that. But I love to add like the little stuff. To me, that's that little stuff that just makes the painting come together and feel completed. And you decide when you're done. The thing with an acrylic painting too is you could decide you're done and then like change your mind and add things. It's the paint medium, you can definitely come back to it. I tend to use disposable, can't talk, disposable palette paper when I'm painting with acrylics a lot of times, but you could easily save your acrylic paint by wrapping it in like plastic wrap or a plastic bag. Just put your palette in that and You can save your colors if you want to. And sometimes we just want to take like a little break, but we want to come back to it. So, some things I do if that's my plan, just or spritz a little water on my palette. They make Stay Wet palettes too. Y'all might have heard of those if you just go to Amazon and type Stay Wet palette, STA dash wet. It'll that's a great palette too. Really good for gouache, really good for um, acrylics. Ooh, yeah, an animal next time. I like that idea, Michelle. I think that's a really good idea. Maybe you can help me pick one. I do really enjoy painting animals. I think animals give you a lot of fun challenges and a lot of fun things to problem solve, like fur or feathers or scales, depending on what you're doing. But yeah, as you can see, I start to add more line work and it just kind of feels more like grass. And what I'm doing when I'm doing this is looking for light areas, dark areas, little line work. Maybe I even want to get in there with a little finer brush and even put more lines in there, however you want to approach that. And then I'm also going to put just a few more little leaves down there as well. I'm going to just visit some of the ones I've already popped in and just kind of brighten them up a little bit too. It's not like they glow on the ground, but they're a little brighter than what I had. So again, a little white can help with the transparency of that yellow and orange paint. But yeah, I just get that little feeling that some have scattered on the ground there, have fallen from the tree. And of course, that tree, I've got a lot more to go on it, really. So yeah, it's kind of what I keep doing is I work down here for a little bit. Okay, now let's go back to the tree and kind of continue to layer that because a lot of that initial paint I started with is dried. So now what I can do is actually layer, not create like a big, mess of colors. Is when you put too much wet paint on top of each other, that's kind of what happens is you kind of will start to run together at a point. And, I won't necessarily finish all of these leaves before we're done. I'm going to wrap up here in just a couple minutes. Like I said, I like to just kind of keep these to about an hour and a half or so with the, you know, acknowledging the fact that I think paintings take time. They really truly do, depending on what you're trying to paint. If you're trying to do something quick, like a small little study, you might find you do finish. But most paintings, you're putting in hours for sure. So I don't know, it's kind of a nice thing. Put on your favorite, music album, put on a podcast, put on a show, and just paint. It's really relaxing and meditative, I think. And, a lot of these colors are kind of mixing on my palette to just create all these kind of different orangey values. Little reds in there. And again, you can play with different size brushes, but think of the density, of leaves of on this tree. There's so many. So, have fun with that layering. Again, I'll just kind of change the color slightly so we can differentiate the leaves and it's not like, it turns into, like I said, one big mass of color. Because we don't want it to turn into a big mass of color. We want to see these leaves that we're building up. And I like the idea that you can see some sky poking through, like in the original reference that we're using. I like that too. So, you can kind of build this up as much as you want to. And then, something else you might end up doing is going back to, let me find my little brush, right in front of me. You might even find yourself after you have a little bit of the leaves done, coming in and adding a few more branches even. She kind of pulled some leaf color with that. So yeah, be careful, let things dry. I rushed that a little. And now I'm putting my hand in paint. Tell ya, that's what happens after I go an hour and a half. We just start to make a mess. But if I want to just bring in, some more branches, because again, these branches are so layered. There's so many of them. And you can have some be lighter, skinnier, thicker, thinner. Have them kind of overlap through each other. However you want that to look. So I'll go ahead, I'm going to peel off the edge of my tape just so we can see this. I've got quite a bit of leaves in there, but I definitely need more. Before I actually peel this off, I'm going to put kind of a lot at the top here real quick. And I am kind of rushing this, so I do advise you to take your time. I just want to see a little bit more of the leaves coming from the top and less like blue up there basically. So I'm just kind of doing this a little bit quicker for time purposes. But yeah, I might let this dry and then just come back to it, continue working it. But let's go ahead and just peel off the tape. I always feel like a painting it doesn't look completed until that tape comes off. And even so, I've got more I could work on. And another thing I didn't really talk much more about, which I will mention really briefly, is that tree trunk. There is more you can do with that tree trunk as well. For example, you can take like some lighter lines and kind of add almost like bark texture, just with like the use of kind of repeated lines going up and down the tree. You can kind of bring in some more of that light that's coming up the tree if you want, this is just some yellow ochre, but that burnt sienna was nice too, just for a little bit of a lighter. And you can kind of mix colors together too. I like to, again, while colors are wet, you can blend them. So that's more of what I could do the tree to kind of build that up if I'm wanting to. And the other thing I'll say with these live paintings I'm starting to do too is you can always do kind of a small painting and then say, hey, I really like that composition. I like that process. And then you can develop it further or make it a bigger painting as well. So sometimes I will treat things as studies that I do spend an hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours on, and then okay, that's it, and that was a learning experience and that's good. So however you want to take it. But what I would do to this, if I wanted to develop this more and really push and render this specific painting, the steps I would take to do that would be to continue to develop some more leaves and actually more branches, some smaller little fine branches kind of going back and forth. I would also revisit my bench, and we see some knots in the wood. I would maybe add some dark marks and kind of play that up, add a little bit more detail in the grass, kind of play with the texture on the trunk a little bit. So I always feel like you can always push things further, take them further. And what I mean by pushing them further is kind of rendering them more, giving them more detail, makes them look a little bit more realistic. And when I say realistic, please know there is a huge range of very realistic to very stylized or abstract. So lots of different ways you can do it. But thank you so much for being here painting with me. Thanks for the suggestion, Michelle, for an animal. I don't have the next posting up for next Sunday, but I'll get that up soon, and we'll get some more lives going. And as always, email me, leave comments if you have questions, if you're watching this after the fact. But yeah, have a great